He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to care anymore. Ethan Walker had spent 3 years learning how to disappear. Into routine, into silence, into a life small enough that nothing could break him again. He was just a nurse now, just a father, just a man trying to get through the day without remembering the one he couldn't save. But the moment he heard her voice crack across that diner, the moment he saw two men laughing at her pain like it was sport, something old and dangerous woke up behind his eyes, like the video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. The alarm went off at 5:14 in the morning, same as always, and Ethan Walker silenced it before the second beep. He had never been a man who needed 2 warnings. He lay still for a moment in the gray early dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling he kept meaning to fix. The apartment was quiet, not peaceful. Quiet was different from peaceful, a distinction he had learned to recognize the way some people learn to read weather. Peaceful meant the silence felt safe. Quiet just meant nothing was making noise yet. He rolled out of bed, pulled on a t-shirt, and padded down the short hallway to check on Maya. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit that was missing an eye. Had been missing it for 2 years since she dropped it at a playground and another kid stepped on it before Ethan could get there. He'd offered to replace it. She'd looked at him like he'd suggested replacing her. "He's fine, Daddy. He just has one eye now." Ethan adjusted the blanket over her shoulder and stood there maybe 15 seconds longer than he needed to. She was 6. She had his dark hair and her mother's jawline and a laugh that came from somewhere neither of them had passed down, something that was entirely hers. He watched her breathe. Then he went to make coffee. The commute to Riverside General took 22 minutes if he caught the lights right. He usually didn't. He'd learned to leave buffer time for the things that didn't go the way you planned, a habit left over from a previous life, one of the few that translated cleanly into civilian existence. He worked trauma and emergency. 12-hour shifts, 3 days a week, with a rotation that occasionally stretched to 4 when they were short-staffed, which was most of the time. The hospital was underfunded and overworked and perpetually one resignation away from crisis. And Ethan had been there long enough to know which supply closet had the best cache of extra nitrile gloves and which attending physicians to flag down in a code and which ones to work around. He was good at the job. He didn't love it the way people in movies love things. Didn't walk in feeling called or chosen or lit up by purpose. He was just good at it, which mattered more in that building than almost anything else. His hands didn't shake. His voice stayed even when everything else in the room was coming apart. He could read a patient's face and their vitals at the same time and prioritize without being asked. His supervisor, a blunt woman named Diane, who had been running the floor for 11 years, had once told him he had the calmest pair of hands she'd ever seen on someone who wasn't a surgeon. "You ever think about med school?" she'd asked. "I think about my daughter," he'd said. Which was true and also an answer to a different question, but Diane had let it go. Maka. He'd grown up in a small town in northern Michigan where the winters lasted too long and the options didn't stretch much further than the county line. He'd enlisted at 18, partly because the recruiter had seemed genuinely interested in him at a time when not many people were, and partly because he needed a direction that wasn't just a way. The Navy had given him structure and then something harder to name, a sense that the work mattered, that the people around him were people worth protecting. He'd done 2 deployments, made it into a specialized unit that required additional years of training, and somewhere in the middle of all that became someone he barely recognized from the boy who'd signed the papers. He didn't talk about the SEALs. Not because he was secretive about it. Most people who knew him figured it out eventually, but because he'd found that the moment you said the words, the conversation stopped being about you and started being about the idea of you. People asked questions they thought were interesting, but were really just projections of things they'd seen in films. He got tired of correcting the record. What he could tell you, if you asked the right questions, was what it felt like to be responsible for the person next to you. Not in theory, in the actual dark, with actual consequences. His daughter attended a public school 4 blocks from their apartment. He dropped her off at 7:45 most mornings, and she ran in without looking back, which he chose to interpret as confidence rather than indifference. Her teacher had told him at the last conference that Maya was socially engaged and verbally assertive. which he was pretty sure was educator language for talks too much, but he'd thanked her anyway. He had a system for the days he worked. Maya went to after-school care until he could pick her up, or, on the longer shifts, went home with their neighbor Mrs. Peralta, who was 63 and moved slowly and made Maya hot chocolate with too much sugar and let her watch cartoons past 8 o'clock. Ethan had mixed feelings about the cartoons. He had no mixed feelings about Mrs. Peralta. "She's fine," Mrs. Peralta told him whenever he apologized for being late. "She's always fine. You worry too much." "Probably," he'd say. He did worry too much. He'd accepted that about himself the same way he'd accepted the water stain and the broken taillight on his truck he kept forgetting to fix. Some things you managed instead of solved. Well, it was a Thursday in early March when everything shifted, not dramatically. That was the thing no one told you about the moments that change your life. They don't announce themselves. They come in the middle of ordinary things while you're tired and undercaffeinated and still thinking about whether you remembered to sign the permission slip for Maya's field trip. He had a half day, rare enough that he hadn't known what to do with himself at first. He'd picked Maya up from school, dropped her with Mrs. Peralta, and then found himself at loose ends in a way that used to be called freedom, but now just felt like a test he hadn't studied for. He ended up at a diner 2 blocks off the main commercial strip, not because it was his favorite, but because it was close and had parking and made decent coffee without charging $4 for the privilege. It was the kind of place that had been there too long to update itself. Laminate tables, booths with cracked vinyl seats patched with electrical tape, a chalkboard menu above the counter that still listed a breakfast combo that probably cost half as much 10 years ago. There was a TV mounted in the corner showing local news with the sound off. The only other customers when he walked in were an older couple sharing a newspaper and a woman sitting alone near the window. He took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs and looked at his phone for a while. He wasn't eavesdropping. He wasn't watching her. He was just in the same room. Yita. The 2 men came in about 15 minutes after he did. He heard them before he registered them specifically. A particular quality of noise, overloud and careless, the kind of entrance that expected the room to rearrange itself. There were 2 of them, early 30s, dressed in the way that signaled money without requiring thought. One wore a jacket that cost more than Ethan made in a week. The other was already on his phone, holding it at chest height like he was prepared to document whatever happened next. They spotted the woman at the window table almost immediately. He didn't know who she was. He learned later, everyone did, eventually, but in that moment she was just a woman sitting alone with a coffee she'd barely touched, and a tablet propped in front of her that she wasn't reading. She had dark circles under her eyes that her makeup didn't quite cover, and she was holding her shoulders in a way that people held their shoulders when they were used to people looking at them and had run out of the energy to perform. Claire, the one in the jacket, said her name like he owned it. "Claire Whitmore, I almost didn't recognize you." She looked up slowly. Something passed across her face. Not fear, exactly. Something more specific than fear. Recognition, maybe, and the particular kind of dread that came with it. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was level, practiced. "You look exhausted." He wasn't saying it with concern. "You hear that, Paul? She looks exhausted." He was already talking to the room, not to her. Last time I saw her, she was on the cover of some magazine. What was it? Next Generation Leaders or something? Big profile, big promises. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited. His friend Paul stayed standing and kept the phone up. "That was before the accident, though." Claire didn't answer. "How's the company doing, Claire? I heard things got complicated." "I'm not doing this with you," she said quietly. "Doing what? Having a conversation?" He leaned back, spreading his arms in mock offense. "I'm just asking. We used to run in the same circles. I'm being friendly." "You're being recorded," she said, looking at the phone. "So are you." Paul smiled. He had the kind of smile that made Ethan's jaw tighten. That's the thing about public places. What happened next was incremental, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't dramatic in the movie way. No shouting, no physical threat yet. It was a slow and deliberate humiliation dressed up as small talk. They referenced the accident without naming it, just enough to make her flinch. They talked about her company's stock performance, got a few details wrong on purpose, then laughed when she corrected them, making the correction itself into the joke. Paul kept the phone on her. Every time she looked away, Marcus said her name again, not letting her go. The older couple had gone very still. The woman behind the counter was watching, but not moving. There was a particular paralysis that happened in these situations. Ethan recognized it, had seen versions of it in very different contexts, where people calculated risk and concluded that intervening cost more than they were willing to spend. He understood the calculation. He'd made it himself more than once, in more ways than one. He put down his coffee. Don't. Hey. That was all he said first. Just hey. Aimed at the table by the window, not loud, just present. Marcus looked over with the expression of a man who'd never had a stranger interrupt him in his life. Excuse me? I said hey. Ethan stood up from the counter. He was not a large man in the way people assumed ex-military were large. He was lean, middle height, the kind of build that didn't announce itself until it had to. She asked you to stop. That was about 4 minutes ago. I was counting. Paul lowered the phone slightly. Who are you? Nobody specific. I'm just sitting here. Ethan moved to a position that put himself between their table and the door without making it look deliberate. But I've been listening, and I think you two should probably leave. Marcus laughed, a short surprise sound that still had contempt in it. You think we should leave? I do, yeah. And if we don't? Ethan looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Not a threat, not a performance, just a look from a man who had learned over many years in very unforgiving places exactly how much of himself to show and when. Whatever Marcus saw in that look, he didn't like it. You have no idea who we are, he said, but his voice had changed slightly, a half-step flatter. Doesn't matter who you are, Ethan said. What matters is that she said stop, and you didn't stop, and now I'm asking you to leave. This is a public place. It is, Ethan agreed. You're welcome to sit somewhere else in it. The standoff lasted maybe 12 seconds, long enough to feel it. Marcus stood slowly, pushing back the chair with more force than necessary. Paul pocketed the phone, but Ethan had already registered the fact that it had been running the whole time. You're making a mistake, Marcus said. Ethan didn't answer. They left. Not running, not rushing. The kind of exit that was already composing its next move, and both of them knew it. The door swung shut and the diner went back to its ambient noise, the TV still flickering without sound, the coffee maker cycling on. Ethan stood there for another second and then turned back toward his seat. Thank you. Her voice came from behind him, quieter than he expected. He looked back. She was sitting very straight, the way people sat when they were working to hold themselves together. There was something in her face that wasn't relief, or wasn't only relief. It was the complicated expression of someone who had been helped and wasn't sure how to feel about needing it. You don't have to thank me, he said. I know. She looked down at the tablet she hadn't been reading. I'm thanking you anyway. He nodded and went back to his seat and tried to remember where he'd been with his eggs. He paid and left 20 minutes later. He didn't get her name. He thought about the phone, about what had been recorded, but he told himself it was nothing. Two guys with a grudge, a confrontation that ended without incident. He told himself he'd done the right thing in the right proportion, which was all he ever tried to do. He picked up Maya from Mrs. Peralta's at 6:15. She had chocolate on her chin and was mid-sentence about something her friend Rosie had said at recess, and he listened to all of it while he helped her with her coat, and by the time they walked home in the cold March air, he had almost convinced himself the afternoon was over. His phone rang at 8:30 after Maya was asleep. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Is this Ethan Walker? The voice on the other end was professional, precise, carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering news they'd delivered before. Who's asking? My name is James Calloway. I'm an attorney. Mr. Walker, I'm calling because a complaint has been filed against you. An assault charge stemming from an incident earlier today at a diner on Morrow Street. A pause. I represent the two men involved. Ethan stood in his kitchen and looked out the window at the dark street below. He had known something like this was coming. He had known it from the moment he saw Marcus stand up and recalculate his options. He had known it the way you knew weather before it arrived, by something in the air that most people couldn't read. He just hadn't expected it this fast. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" The attorney sounded surprised by the calm. "Yeah." Ethan reached over and turned off the kitchen light, standing in the dark. "Tell me what comes next." He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He lay down because lying down was what you did when it was past 10 and your daughter was asleep in the next room and there was nothing left to fix before morning. But sleep didn't come. What came instead was the particular kind of wakefulness that feels like punishment. When your mind runs back over a thing again and again, not searching for a solution, just rehearsing the sequence of events the way you might press a bruise to confirm it was still there. He kept coming back to the phone. Paul's phone, held at chest height, pointed at Claire's face while Marcus talked around her like she was a problem someone else had left on the table. He'd registered it in the moment, filed it the way he filed information under pressure, quick and factual. But he hadn't understood yet what it meant. What it meant was that they'd walked in with a plan. Not a plan to confront her specifically, maybe, but a readiness, a willingness to use whatever they found. He'd been in enough situations to recognize the difference between impulsive cruelty and deliberate cruelty, and what he'd seen in that diner was the second kind, which made the phone call from the attorney less surprising and more clarifying. They hadn't filed a complaint out of anger. They'd filed it as a next step in something that was already in motion. He got up at 2 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about that. The problem wasn't the charge itself, assault, which was a significant overstatement of what had happened and which any halfway decent security camera should contradict. The problem was what an assault charge did to a nursing license before anyone proved anything. The problem was what it did to a custody arrangement, to a background check, to a school that already treated single fathers with a particular low-grade suspicion he'd learned to navigate carefully. The problem was that the machinery of consequence moved faster than the machinery of truth, and the men who'd filed that complaint knew it. He refilled the glass and stood at the sink for a while. At 3:15, he went back to bed. At 5:14, the alarm went off. He called in to the hospital that morning. Not a sick day, just a heads up to Diane that he might need to speak to HR sometime in the coming week. That there was a situation, which was a word that felt too small for what it was, but was also the only word he had that didn't make it sound worse than he could handle. Diane asked 3 questions in quick succession, got 3 short answers, and then said, "Get ahead of it before it gets ahead of you," which was exactly the advice he would have given someone else, and which he already knew and which still helped to hear from outside himself. He dropped Maya at school and watched her run in and thought, not her. Whatever this costs, it doesn't touch her. Then he sat in his truck for 4 minutes and made a call he had not expected to be making from a diner's parking lot aftermath. Colonel Ray Whitfield, retired, though the rank had never left him, picked up on the second ring, same as he always had. The man had operated on 4 hours of sleep for approximately 20 years and seemed to have recalibrated his entire system around it. "Walker." Not a question, just an acknowledgement. "Sir, I have a problem." "Tell me." He told him. All of it. The diner, the 2 men, the phone, the attorney's call at 8:30. He left nothing out and editorialized nothing. Whitfield listened without interrupting, which was one of the qualities that had made him an exceptional commander and also an occasionally terrifying one. When Ethan finished, there was a short silence. "How bad is the charge?" Whitfield asked. "Assault. No weapon, no injury. But the family has money, and they got to an attorney before I even left the zip code." "Who's the family?" The attorney said Hargrove, first name Marcus. Another pause, longer this time. "As in Hargrove Capital." "I don't know what that is." "It's a private equity firm, the kind that buys politicians the way other people buy used cars." Whitfield's voice had not changed in register, but something in it had sharpened. "The father is Gerald Hargrove. He has been in 3 different federal investigations over the past decade and walked out of all 3 without a scratch. The kind of man who treats the law as a suggestion and lawyers as a subscription service." Ethan absorbed that. "So, not small." "Not small, but not invincible either. Nothing is invincible that leaves evidence behind." A pause. "The diner had cameras?" "It's a diner. I'm assuming yes. Get the footage before they do. Or get someone to get it before they do. Do you have an attorney? Not yet. I know someone. She's handled military cases before. Good instincts, doesn't panic, doesn't let things get philosophical in a courtroom. He paused again, and Ethan heard the sound of papers or something shifting on a desk. I'll make a call. Give me an hour. You don't have to. Walker. The colonel's voice cut across him, not unkindly. What do you think I've been waiting for the last 3 years? A reason to do something useful? He said it dryly, but there was something underneath it that Ethan chose not to examine too closely. Give me an hour. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. She called at 10:45, introduced herself in 2 sentences, and then said, "Tell me what happened and don't leave anything out because I need to hear the version that makes you look worse before I can help you." He told her the same way he'd told Whitfield. Straight, no spin. When he finished, she said, "You put yourself between her and the door." I was moving to a position. It wasn't intentional. Doesn't matter if it was. If they captured it on the phone video, it can be characterized as menacing. We need to get in front of that. She spoke quickly and practically, the way people spoke when they'd seen too many cases drag out over slow thinking. The diner camera footage is the priority. I'll file for it today. The other thing we need is her. Claire Whitmore. Yes. If she's willing to speak on the record about what happened before you intervened, what they were doing, how long it had been going on, what they said, that changes the frame entirely. Right now, the Hargrove side is framing this as an aggressive stranger inserting himself into a private confrontation. If she testifies to what it actually was, the confrontation stops being private. It becomes a witnessed harassment with a witness. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I don't have her contact information. I'll find it. A pause, during which he heard typing. Is there anything between you and her? Prior relationship? History? Any reason she might not want to help you? I met her for about 4 minutes at a diner. She thanked me. People thank people all the time and then disappear when it gets complicated, Sandra said. Not brutally, just honestly. Don't assume she'll cooperate, but we need to find out. He learned who Claire Whitmore was the same way most people learn things they'd missed. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one adding context to the last until the picture clarified. He read 2 articles on his phone that afternoon while Maya was at school. Then a third. Then he stopped, because the information was starting to feel like a kind of intrusion. She was 30 years old. She had founded a technology company called Whitmore Systems at 24. After 2 years at a firm where, according to a profile piece that was careful about what it said and more revealing about what it implied, she had developed a product that her employer had attempted to claim as company property. She had fought that, and won, and used the settlement to start her own operation. By 28, Whitmore Systems had 40 employees and contracts with 2 federal agencies. Then, 14 months ago, there had been an accident. The articles were vague on the specifics. A serious accident, a period of recovery, challenges in the company's leadership structure, the kind of language that meant something significant had happened and everyone involved had agreed to be circumspect about the details. The company had survived, but the stock had dropped. There had been a board restructuring. There were people, apparently, who had decided that her vulnerability in the aftermath of the accident was an opportunity. Marcus Hargrove was 27. His father's money had funded a series of ventures that all shared the characteristic of involving other people's work and Marcus's signature. He and Claire had apparently overlapped in certain professional circles, which was a polite way of saying they had probably met at the kind of events where ambitious people went to be seen by other ambitious people, and something in that history had curdled into whatever it had become by the morning in the diner. Ethan put his phone down and looked at the ceiling. He had seen that expression on her face, the one when Marcus had said her name. He'd read it as recognition and dread, and he'd been right, but now he understood it had more architecture than that. It was the face of someone who had been working very hard to maintain something fragile, and who had just realized that the people who knew exactly how fragile it was had walked through the door. Sandra called back at 2 o'clock. I reached her assistant. Claire Whitmore has agreed to a meeting. He was surprised. He didn't show it because he was on the phone and there was no one to see it, but he felt it. When? Tomorrow morning, her office. A brief pause. She asked if you'd be coming alone. Yes. Good. Don't bring me yet. This first conversation is about establishing whether she's willing to be involved at all. Don't pressure her. Don't explain what the case needs from her before she's decided she wants to help. Let her talk first. I know how to listen, he said. I know you do, Sandra said. I'm saying it anyway. He'd been to a handful of tech company offices over the years for various reasons, and they tended toward one of two aesthetics. Either the deliberate casualness of exposed brick and ping-pong tables and a dog wandering around, or the glass and steel minimalism that was supposed to communicate that serious people did serious work here. Whitmore Systems occupied the fourth floor of a building on the north side of the business district and split the difference in a way that felt less like a design choice than a genuine uncertainty about what it wanted to be. The receptionist was young and very professional and did not ask him to wait long. Claire Whitmore came out herself, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected an assistant or a coordinator or some layer of buffer. Instead, she appeared in the hallway wearing a gray blazer over a dark shirt, her hair pulled back in a way that was functional rather than styled. And she walked toward him without hesitating, which told him she'd already made some version of a decision about this meeting before he'd walked through the door. Mr. Walker, she said, and extended her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were direct. Miss Whitmore, thank you for seeing me. Come on back. Her office was at the end of the hall and had one large window that looked out over the street below. There were 2 chairs and a low table in addition to the desk, and she gestured toward the chairs rather than the desk, which he noted. She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the expression of someone who had gotten very good at gathering information from a face. How bad is it? She asked. Not what's happening, not can you explain, just the direct center of the question. Bad enough, he said. The Hargroves filed an assault complaint. My attorney is working on the diner footage, but the framing of what happened is going to depend on whether someone who was actually there can speak to what those men were doing before I said anything. She was quiet for a moment, not thinking. She had already thought. She was deciding whether to say what she'd already concluded. Marcus Hargrove has been trying to acquire a stake in my company for the past 8 months, she said. His father wants the federal contracts. I've refused the deal 4 times. She looked at the window briefly, then back at him. The accident I had, I was in a car, bad weather, another driver. I had a spinal contusion and 3 months of physical therapy. I'm fine now, or mostly. She said the last 2 words with a flatness that indicated she'd argued with people about what mostly meant, and had stopped expecting them to understand. But during that time, my board voted to open a new round of funding that I hadn't authorized. Gerald Hargrove submitted a bid. By the time I was recovered enough to fight it, the paperwork was halfway through. Ethan said nothing. He let her continue. I stopped it. But it cost me. It cost me people on my board. It cost me a contract that walked when things got uncertain, and it cost me 8 months of running my company with one eye on the boardroom and one on the door. She paused. Marcus knew all of that. He walks into that diner and finds me sitting alone looking like I haven't slept in a week. And he sees what everyone sees when they look at someone who's been holding something together by force of will. He sees a crack. Her voice didn't waver, but it tightened slightly, the way voices did when a person was being accurate about something they wished weren't true. He was going to put that video online. I could see it happening. Look how far she's fallen. That kind of thing. She stopped. You interrupted that. I did, Ethan said. And now they're charging you with assault so that the story shifts from what they were doing to what you did. That's the plan, seems like. She looked at him for a moment. He noticed she had the same quality she'd had in the diner. The ability to be very still without it seeming like passivity. It was control of a specific kind. The kind you developed when being watched was an occupational reality. What does your attorney need from me? She asked. A statement about what happened before I intervened, what they said, how long it had been going on, your read on the situation, nothing you didn't witness directly. I can do that. She said it simply, without drama, the way people agreed to things they'd already decided on before being asked. I want to be clear about something, though. She met his eyes. I'm not doing this because you saved me. I know that sounds... No, he said. I understand. I'm doing it because they're doing the same thing to you that they tried to do to my company, creating a story and flooding the space until the truth can't get traction. She paused. I've watched that happen enough times. I'm not watching it again. He nodded. There was something almost relieving about her directness, the absence of the soft gratitude he wouldn't have known what to do with. She wasn't looking at him like a rescuer. She was looking at him like a person who'd gotten caught in the same machinery she had and needed someone to hold the other end. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Gerald Hargrove is going to come after me when he finds out I'm involved. He will make the acquisition fight look like a courtesy call. I know. Do you? Not challenging, genuinely asking, checking whether he understood the weight of it. I faced people who had more resources than me and were more willing to use them, he said. It doesn't always go the way they plan. She studied him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door does when someone on the other side decides you're probably not a threat. You were military, she said. Not a question. Navy. Long? Long enough. He paused. I'm a nurse now. She considered that for a second, and he waited for the thing people usually said, some version of that's quite a change, but she didn't say it. Instead, she said, that tracks, actually. And it was so plainly true that he almost laughed. He drove home through the late afternoon traffic and thought about the call he'd have to make to Whitfield tonight, the update, the timeline, what came next. He thought about Maya, who would need dinner and a bath, and someone to listen to more stories about Rosie and whatever had happened at recess. He thought about the camera footage and whether the diner's system was digital or analog and whether anyone had already gotten to the owner. He thought briefly about Claire Whitmore's expression when she'd said mostly, the word she used for herself the way he'd been using fine for years. The unspoken negotiation with the truth that people made when they were holding more than they wanted to admit. He pulled into his parking space and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. Whitfield had asked him, years ago, during a debrief after a mission that hadn't gone cleanly, had asked him what he'd do differently. Ethan had said nothing, which at the time was a survival answer, a way of not reopening the wound to prove it was still bleeding. What he would have said, if he'd had the language for it then, was, I would have stayed. I would have faced the thing instead of going around it. He got out of the truck. He went upstairs. He made dinner and listened about Rosie, and when Maya fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table again, same chair as the night before, and this time the wakefulness didn't feel like punishment. It felt like the beginning of something he hadn't yet finished preparing for, which was different and harder in a way, but also the first thing in a long time that felt like it was pointing forward rather than back. His phone buzzed. Sandra. Diner manager confirmed security system. Footage is intact. I filed the preservation request. Don't talk to anyone about this case except me and Whitfield. He typed back, understood. Then he put the phone face down on the table and sat with the quiet for a while, letting it be what it was. Not peaceful, not safe, but real and present and his. The arraignment was on a Tuesday, which felt arbitrary in the way that all procedural things felt arbitrary. As if the calendar itself was indifferent to the weight of what it was scheduling. Sandra had told him what to expect. A brief appearance, a formal reading of the charge, a plea, and then the slow mechanical grind of pre-trial proceedings that could stretch weeks or months depending on how aggressively the Hargrove side wanted to push. What she hadn't told him, or maybe had told him and he hadn't fully absorbed, was what it would feel like to stand in a courthouse hallway in a collared shirt he'd ironed that morning while Maya was eating cereal, knowing that his name was about to be read aloud in a room full of strangers, as someone accused of something he hadn't done. Not guilt, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The feeling of being made into a version of yourself you didn't recognize and having to stand still while it happened. Whitfield had offered to come. Ethan had told him not to, and meant it. This was not a situation that required a former colonel standing in the gallery as a show of force. It was a situation that required patience and documentation and not doing anything that could be reframed as aggressive, which was a particular discipline for a man whose instincts ran toward direct action. He understood that. He was practicing it. Sandra stood beside him, reviewed the charge with the flat attention of someone reading a utility bill, and entered a not guilty plea in a voice that contained no uncertainty whatsoever. The judge set a preliminary hearing date 5 weeks out. The Hargrove attorney, a different one this time, older, the kind who'd clearly been hired at a rate that communicated seriousness, acknowledged the date and said nothing else. He didn't need to. He had the posture of a man who expected to win before the work was done. Ethan watched him and said nothing. They were outside in the gray morning air within 25 minutes. Sandra walked fast and he kept pace without effort. "The footage," he said. "I have it. I watched it last night." She didn't slow down. "It's good. It shows Marcus and Paul arriving, shows them approaching her table without invitation, shows 17 minutes of what any reasonable person would describe as coordinated harassment, shows you standing up, shows the exchange, shows them leaving." She paused at the corner. "It does not show you touch either of them." "Because I didn't touch either of them." "I know. The footage confirms that. What it also shows is you moving to a position between them and the door, which their attorney will argue was a physical intimidation tactic." "I was creating an exit path," Ethan said. "Standard," he stopped. "Standard what?" "Standard practice for de-escalation in a confined space," he said. "You put yourself where someone can leave without it becoming a confrontation." Sandra looked at him sideways. "You're going to have to explain that to a jury in terms that don't sound like military doctrine." "I know. Practice it that way." They reached her car and she stopped, turned to face him with her hands in her coat pockets. The wind was doing something aggressive to her collar that she ignored. "The bigger problem right now isn't the footage. The footage helps us. The bigger problem is what Gerald Hargrove did this morning. He'd felt this coming." "What did he do?" "He called 3 people. She said it the way people said things they wished they didn't have to say. "Your hospital's board chairman, the state nursing licensing board's compliance officer, and a journalist who runs a mid-sized local news outlet that has a history of accepting Gerald Hargrove's ad spend." She held his gaze. "The hospital hasn't contacted you yet, but they will. The licensing board inquiry is preliminary. It's standard process when a complaint involves a licensed professional, and it doesn't mean anything by itself. But it's a clock, and the journalist published something this morning." He already knew it was bad. He asked anyway. "What kind of something?" She pulled out her phone, turned it toward him. The headline was 5 words: "Ex-SEAL attacks. Men at diner." Below it, a paragraph that described him as a former special operations soldier with a history of high-stress service who had confronted and physically menaced 2 businessmen, which was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and who was now facing assault charges. There was a photo of him that he did not remember being taken, which meant someone had been outside the courthouse this morning. He looked at the photo for a moment. It was a decent picture of him, technically. He looked like someone you would cross the street to avoid, which he suspected was the point. "They're not charging you in the press," Sandra said, putting the phone away. "They're building the jury pool. Get enough people to read ex-SEAL attacks men before the trial starts, and you're fighting perception instead of evidence." She paused. "Which means we need to move faster than I'd planned. Claire Whitmore's statement needs to be on record before this takes hold." Claire called him that evening, which surprised him. He'd had her number from Sandra's coordination, but he hadn't expected her to use his. "I saw the article," she said when he picked up. No preamble. "Sandra sent it to me this morning." "Gerald Hargrove placed 4 calls to people in my orbit today as well," Claire said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not quite anger, but the compressed pressure that came before anger when you were the kind of person who processed things before you expressed them. 2 board members, my largest vendor, and a woman who used to be on my executive team who left last year under circumstances that are complicated, and who Gerald apparently believes might be willing to say unflattering things about my judgment in exchange for being listened to. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. Maya was asleep. The apartment was in its nighttime quiet. He moves fast, he said. He's been doing this for 30 years, Claire said. He doesn't wait to see if you'll go away. He accelerates until you don't have the energy to keep standing. A pause. I've been watching him do it to other people for 8 months. I didn't think he'd turn it on a nurse who stopped his son from making a video. He's not turning it on me because of the video, Ethan said. He's turning it on me because you're standing beside me, and that's inconvenient for whatever he was planning next with your company. There was a silence on the other end. He could tell she was thinking about it. Not that she hadn't considered it, but that hearing it said plainly made something settle. You're right, she said. You don't have to do this, he said. Sandra can work with what we have. The footage is strong. If the cost of your involvement is… Stop. Her voice was flat, but not unkind. I already told you why I'm doing this. That hasn't changed because Gerald Hargrove made some phone calls. Another pause, shorter. Has he contacted your daughter's school? The question hit him sideways, which she probably intended. He hadn't thought about it. He was thinking about it now. I don't know, he said. Check tomorrow, first thing. She said it without apology, because it wasn't cruel, it was practical. She had spent 8 months learning how Gerald Hargrove operated. He won't do anything to a child directly. He's not that kind of villain, but he'll plant seeds with administrators, suggest concerns about the home environment, create a situation where the school feels it has to be careful around you. It's soft pressure, the kind you don't notice until it's already shaped the room. How do you know all this? Because he did it to my physical therapist, she said, when I was recovering. My PT was also treating the wife of a city councilman who Gerald wanted a vote from. Gerald let it be known that the PT had been involved in a malpractice complaint 3 years earlier, which was true, and the complaint had been dismissed, but the knowing was enough. The PT lost 2 clients in a week. The picture that was assembling itself in Ethan's mind was not new in its essential shape. He had understood certain kinds of power for a long time, understood that resource and willingness were a more dangerous combination than size or strength. But the texture of it here, the civilian specificity of how it was applied, made it feel different in ways he was still calibrating. He wants you scared, Ethan said. He wants me isolated, Claire corrected. Scared is a byproduct. Isolation is the goal. Get everyone around a person to hedge their bets, and eventually the person is standing alone in a room they used to share with 20 people. She stopped. That's not going to happen this time. He believed her, not because she sounded invincible, she didn't, quite, but because she sounded like someone who had run the math and decided the alternative was worse. The hospital called on Thursday morning. He'd been expecting it, but the form it took was not the form he'd prepared for. It wasn't HR. It was the chief of medicine, a man named Dr. Alan Presser, whom Ethan had respected for 3 years without ever spending more than 8 minutes in a room with him alone. Presser's assistant called first to schedule, which was a bad sign. A good sign would have been Presser calling himself informally to give him a heads up. Scheduling meant there was a procedure being followed. He went into the meeting in the same collared shirt. Different day, same feeling. Presser's office was organized in the specific way of people who needed to project competence under scrutiny. Everything in its place, nothing on the desk that didn't belong there. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of doctor who had probably been impressive at 40 and had settled into a somewhat different kind of impressive at 58. Ethan, he said, sit down. He sat. I want to be upfront about what this conversation is, Presser said. The board has received a letter. It came from an attorney representing Gerald Hargrove on behalf of his son Marcus, who has filed a complaint against you. The letter recommends, and I'm using their language, that the hospital consider the reputational and legal implications of continuing to employ Mr. Walker during an active assault investigation. He put the letter down flat. That's what it says. Okay, Ethan said. I want to hear your version of what happened. He told it. Same way he'd told everyone. Straight, no interpretation offered. He described what he saw, what he said, what happened, what didn't happen. Presser listened without moving. When Ethan finished, the doctor was quiet for a moment. You didn't touch either of them, he said. No. Your attorney has the security footage. Yes. Presser nodded slowly. He looked at the letter again, not like he was reading it, more like he was deciding something. "The board is going to want me to recommend administrative leave pending the outcome of the trial," he said. "That's what their attorney's letter is designed to produce. It's not a legal requirement. There's no obligation to remove you based on an unproven charge, but it's the path of least institutional friction." Ethan said nothing. "I'm not going to recommend it," Presser said. He looked up. "I've had 40 nurses in this department over 11 years, Presser said. "You're in the top 4 by any metric I use. Your patient outcomes, your composure under pressure, the way junior staff trust your reads on a situation." He folded his hands. "I'm also not naive. If this goes badly, if the charges stick or the PR gets out of control, the board will make the decision regardless of my recommendation, and I'll have spent political capital I needed for the new ICU proposal." He said this without self-pity, just as information. But that's where we are, not where we are today. Today, I'm telling the board that an unproven complaint filed by a wealthy family with documented political interests does not constitute grounds for action against an employee with your record. Ethan held the even tone he'd been holding for days. "I appreciate that, sir." "Don't appreciate it yet," Presser said, with a dryness that reminded him of Whitfield. "Appreciate it if we both get through this without the building burning down." He stood, which meant the meeting was ending. "Keep me updated through HR. Don't talk to journalists. And Ethan, whatever happened in that diner, I don't think you did anything wrong. But the way this world works is that being right isn't always sufficient protection. So build your case like being right doesn't matter, and let being right be the bonus." Whitfield arrived in town on a Friday without announcing it in advance, which was also characteristic. He called from the parking lot of a coffee shop 3 blocks from Ethan's apartment and said, "I'm outside, come down when you have a minute," as if he'd just happened to be in the neighborhood. He was 61 and carried himself like he was 50 and felt like he was 45. He had gray at his temples and a way of occupying space that wasn't aggressive but was simply definite, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. Ethan had known him for 12 years and still occasionally found him hard to read, which he suspected was intentional. They sat at a corner table with their coffees, and Whitfield listened to the full update without taking notes, which meant he'd already done his own research and was triangulating. "Gerald Hargrove contacted 3 of your professional connections," Whitfield said when Ethan finished. "He contacted multiple people around Claire Whitmore. He placed a piece in a newspaper." He paused. "That's not a defensive response to an assault complaint. That's a coordinated campaign." "I know." "Which means someone told him this had the potential to go beyond a diner confrontation before it even reached the attorney's desk." Whitfield wrapped his hands around his cup. "Marcus filed the complaint, but Gerald activated the machinery. You don't activate that kind of machinery unless you see something worth suppressing." Ethan looked at him. "Claire. The timing with her company doesn't feel like coincidence," Whitfield said. "She's been blocking an acquisition for 8 months. You enter the picture and suddenly become a lever. Put pressure on you, put pressure on her. See if one or both of them fold." He took a sip of coffee. "It's not sophisticated, it's just expensive. And expensive can substitute for sophisticated when you have enough of it. What do we do with that? Sandra needs to know the acquisition angle. If Gerald's motivations extend beyond defending his son and into pressuring Whitmore's systems, that's relevant to the character of the complaint. It turns a harassment suit into something with an underlying business motive, which changes how a jury hears it." He set the cup down. "Have you told Sandra about Claire's acquisition situation?" "Not in detail." "Tell her in detail." He paused. "How is the girl?" Ethan understood the shift. "Maya's fine. She doesn't know what's happening." "Does she need to?" "Not yet." Whitfield nodded. He looked at the table for a moment and then back up, and the look on his face was one Ethan had seen before. Not many times, but enough to know it meant the colonel was about to say something he'd been holding for longer than this conversation. "You know," Whitfield said, "when you left the service, I didn't try to talk you out of it. I thought you needed distance. I thought some time and some quiet would—" He stopped himself. "I watched you build something small and careful, and I told myself it was what you needed." He paused. "I'm not sure anymore it was what you chose, as opposed to what felt safest." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "I'm not running," he said. "No, you're not." Whitfield allowed something close to a small smile, which is the first time in 3 years I'd say that with confidence. Look, the preliminary hearing was 4.5 weeks away when Sandra called to say the Hargrove attorneys had filed a motion to suppress the diner security footage on the grounds that it had been improperly obtained through what they termed procedurally irregular evidence preservation. Ethan sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot on his lunch break and listened to Sandra explain what this meant in practice. She was calm, which was a deliberate professionalism. He'd learned in the past weeks to read the difference between her "I'm calm because this is fine" voice and her "I'm calm because I need you to stay calm" voice. This was the second one. "They're arguing that my preservation filing was premature and non-standard," she said. "The motion won't succeed. I followed procedure, but it will delay the footage being formally admitted, and more importantly, it signals what their strategy is." Which is what? Contaminate everything before the judge can see it clearly. If they can't suppress the footage, they'll argue it's misleading, decontextualized, that the angle doesn't capture what their client describes as Ethan Walker's threatening posture and aggressive vocal tone. They'll call the diner owner as a witness and try to establish that you were a regular who had some prior rapport with the management, implying the footage was preserved cooperatively rather than neutrally. She paused. "They're going to try to make every piece of evidence look like it has a thumb on the scale." "Can they?" "They can try. They have the budget for it." A short silence. "But here's what they don't have. They don't have Paul's phone video." He sat up slightly. "What do you mean?" "Paul recorded most of the encounter on his phone, we know that. What they don't know is that the diner's system has a second camera angle, a narrow field camera aimed at the service counter that happens to capture the window table from a side profile. I found it when I reviewed the full system layout." He could hear her choosing her words carefully. "In that footage, you can see Paul's phone. You can see what's on the screen while he's recording. And what's on that screen before you ever stand up from the counter is Claire Whitmore's face, zoomed in, while Marcus Hargrove is talking." Ethan understood what she was saying. "They came in planning to record her. They came in with the camera already running, before any confrontation, before you said a word, before there was any argument to document." Her voice hadn't changed, but the weight behind it had. "That's not two men defending themselves against an aggressive stranger. That's two men who walked into a diner with the intention to capture something. The footage doesn't just clear you, Ethan. It exposes what they were actually doing." The parking lot outside his windshield was ordinary and gray and full of people going about their ordinary days. He looked at it for a moment. "Sandra," he said. "Yeah." "How long have you known about the second camera?" "Since Tuesday," she said. "I wanted to confirm the angle was usable before I told you. I didn't want to give you something to hold on to and then have to take it back." "Okay. Are you okay?" It was the first time she'd asked him that in 4 weeks of working together. He noticed the question and gave it a real answer rather than a reflexive one. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm tired, but I'm okay." "Good. Because the preliminary hearing is in 18 days and I need you clear-headed for all of them." A pause. "One more thing. I got a call from Gerald Hargrove's personal attorney this morning, not the one you saw at arraignment, the personal one. He suggested, informally and entirely off the record, that Mr. Hargrove would consider having his son withdraw the complaint in exchange for a signed confidentiality agreement and your resignation from Riverside General. The anger that moved through him was brief and clean, like a circuit completing. No. That's what I told him. In those words? Slightly more legal language, Sandra said, but the substance was identical. He picked Maya up from school that afternoon and she wanted to go to the park despite the cold, and he said yes because she'd been in after-school care for too many afternoons lately and because there was a specific thing that happened to him when she ran on open ground without restraint, arms out, shoes hitting the dead grass, laughing at nothing, that reset something in him that nothing else quite touched. He sat on a bench and watched her and thought about the second camera, about the image of Paul's phone already running when they walked in, about the specific premeditation that implied, and what it said about what they'd planned to do to her in that diner. He thought about Claire, not in a complicated way, not yet, just as a person who had spent 8 months holding something together under sustained pressure and who had not folded and who had walked into her own office and told him the truth about her situation without asking him to feel sorry about it. He thought about Danny. Danny Chen had been his closest teammate for 4 years, had been quiet and wickedly funny and constitutionally incapable of letting a hard situation pass without finding the one absurd thing in it that made it bearable. Had died on a mountainside in a country Ethan was not authorized to name, in a situation that had gone wrong in the way that situations went wrong, not through incompetence, not through failure, but through the specific cruelty of variables that no amount of preparation could eliminate. Before he died, not right before, not in a movie way, but a few weeks earlier, during a quiet evening that neither of them had known was going to be one of the last, Danny had talked about a woman named Claire. He hadn't said it with the weight of someone making a dying wish. He'd said it the way he said most things, sideways, oblique, like he was telling you something without quite admitting he was telling you something. "There's this person," he'd said. "She's going to need someone to check on her. I'm not good at the long-distance thing. You're better at showing up." Ethan had said he would. He had not shown up. He had told himself it was the guilt that kept him away. But the truth he'd been edging toward for 3 years was that it was simpler than guilt. It was fear. Fear that being near her would require explaining things he didn't know how to explain, that it would make Danny's absence real in a new and specific way he wasn't ready for. He hadn't known her name. He'd had a first name, a city, a professional field, enough to find her if he'd looked. He had not looked. And then he'd walked into a diner on a Thursday afternoon, and she had been sitting at a window table, and Marcus Hargrove had said her name, and Ethan had stood up from the counter. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know if it was a coincidence or something his subconscious had engineered, or simply the world being strange in the particular way it was occasionally strange. He hadn't told Sandra. He hadn't told Whitfield. He wasn't sure he could tell Claire. Maya ran back to the bench, slightly out of breath, cheeks red from the cold. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate on the way home?" "Yeah," he said, "we can do that." She grabbed his hand and pulled him up from the bench, and he let himself be pulled, and they walked out of the park in the fading afternoon light. And he held her hand and thought about Danny, and about promises made without knowing what they'd cost, and about the specific and sometimes unreasonable way that life had of holding you to the things you'd said, even when you'd long since stopped believing you were capable of keeping them. The preliminary hearing lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than Sandra had predicted, and shorter than the Hargrove attorneys had probably hoped for. Ethan sat at the defense table in the same collared shirt. He had 2 now, had bought a second one at a department store the week before, because wearing the same shirt to every legal proceeding felt like a kind of superstition he didn't want to test, and kept his hands flat on the table in front of him and listened to arguments that were about him without quite being addressed to him, which was one of the stranger features of the legal process he'd had to adjust to. You were the subject of the room, and simultaneously not its audience. The Hargrove attorney, the older one, whose name was Clifton Reed, and who had the practiced smoothness of someone who billed by the hour and had long since stopped finding courtrooms interesting, presented the motion to suppress first. Sandra had told him it would fail, and it did fail, though it took the better part of 90 minutes to confirm that failure through procedural argument that Ethan followed about 60% of. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Honorable Patricia Dole, who had the specific economy of someone who had been listening to attorneys talk for too long and had developed an efficient internal filter for the parts that mattered. She denied the suppression motion in language that was brief and not particularly warm toward the argument that had produced it. Reed accepted the denial with the practiced grace of someone who had filed the motion to create a delay rather than to win it, which meant he got what he actually wanted regardless. Then came the preliminary question of scope, what the trial would be permitted to examine, which witnesses the defense could call, whether Claire Whitmore's testimony about events preceding Ethan's involvement would be admissible. This was the part Sandra had prepared for most carefully, and he watched her work with the same attention he'd given to people who were good at difficult things in high-stakes environments. She was not dramatic. She didn't perform. She made arguments in clear sentences and cited precedent in a way that sounded like she was simply reminding the judge of things the judge already knew, which he suspected was intentional. She established that what happened at the table before Ethan stood up was not ancillary context, but the essential condition that made his response comprehensible. She used the word comprehensible rather than justified, which was a distinction he appreciated. Judge Dole allowed it. All of it. Claire's testimony, the second camera angle, the timeline of Paul's recording, beginning before any confrontation existed. She looked at Reed when she ruled and said, "The defense has established that the events preceding the defendant's involvement are directly material to the question of intent." And Reed wrote something on his legal pad that Ethan couldn't read from where he was sitting. Outside the courthouse, Sandra said, "That's the best possible outcome from today." But Reed filed a counter-motion I didn't expect. He's asking to admit Ethan's military service record into evidence, specifically the classified portions redacted, with the redactions themselves offered as implication. Ethan looked at her. The redactions as implication. He wants a jury to see a document full of black bars and draw their own conclusions about what a Navy SEAL with classified history is capable of. She said it without editorializing, which was its own kind of editorial. It's a legitimate legal motion, and Judge Dole didn't deny it outright. She's giving us 2 weeks to respond. He stood on the courthouse steps in the cold air and looked at the street. "How do we respond?" he asked. "We argue that a redacted service record with no specific allegations is prejudicial without being probative. It tells the jury nothing factual, but invites them to speculate, which is exactly the kind of inference Reed wants them drawing." She paused. "We also have Colonel Whitfield. If we put him on the stand to testify about your service record, the character of your training, the specific discipline around use of force, we take control of that narrative instead of letting the black bars tell it." "Whitfield on the stand," Ethan said. "He already offered," Sandra said. He hadn't known that. He looked at her. "He called me on Wednesday," she said. Said to use him, however, was useful and not to ask his permission first because he'd already given it. He told Claire about the hearing that evening. He'd gotten into the habit of brief updates. Not because Sandra required it, but because Claire was involved in the case, and because she'd asked, early on, to be kept informed rather than managed, which was a distinction he'd respected immediately. He texted first the way he always did, and she called back within 10 minutes, which was also the pattern they'd developed without discussing it. "Reedy's motion on the service record," she said when he'd finished. "That's the play I'd have made too, if I were him. It's effective. It's cheap," she said. "But cheap works." A pause. "How are you actually doing with all of this?" He'd noticed she asked that question differently than most people asked it. Most people asked, "How are you doing?" as a social formality, a handshake in sentence form. Claire asked it like she wanted the actual answer and had budgeted time for it. "I'm managing," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was in the kitchen. Maya was asleep. The apartment was doing its quiet thing. "I don't sleep well," he said. "I function fine. I'm present at work. I'm present with Maya. But there's a background noise that doesn't go off." He paused, surprised at himself for saying it. "Like having a low-grade alarm running under everything else." "I know that feeling," she said, quietly enough that he understood she wasn't just being polite. "The accident," he said. "During recovery, yeah. The first 2 months, A pause. "It wasn't the pain that was the worst part. It was the uncertainty. Not knowing what would come back and what wouldn't. You keep testing yourself. Can I stand up without holding the wall? Can I make it to the end of the hall? And every test is also a fear, because the answer might be no." She stopped. "At some point I realized I was spending more energy being afraid of the assessment than on the recovery itself. So I stopped assessing and just did the next thing." "Just the next thing," he repeated. "I'm not saying it works," she said. "I'm saying it was the only way I got through it." He thought about that. Danny used to say something similar. Don't solve next week's problem with today's energy. He thought most anxiety was just premature accounting. There was a pause on her end. Not uncomfortable, more like she was holding something. "Danny," she said. Not a question, but something in her voice had changed. He understood. In the moment after he'd said the name, that he'd crossed a threshold. He'd said it without planning to, which was how the true things came out, and now it was in the room between them and he'd have to decide what to do with it. He was my teammate, Ethan said. He died 3 years ago, on a mission. Silence. He mentioned someone named Claire, Ethan said. He kept his voice even because the alternative was not something he could manage right now. In the weeks before, he said she was going to need someone to check in on her. I didn't know a last name. I didn't look. He stopped. I should have looked. The silence on her end lasted long enough that he wondered if she was still there. Danny Chen, she said finally. Her voice was careful, not broken. Careful, the way you were careful with something that could still hurt you if you weren't. Yes. We were... She stopped. We knew each other for about a year. It was complicated, not in a bad way, just in the way things are complicated when both people are very busy and very bad at saying what they mean. A pause. I didn't find out what happened to him until 2 months after. Someone mutual told me. By then there was nothing to... There wasn't any way to... She stopped again. I'm sorry, he said. I should have found you. I told him I would. You were grieving too, she said. That's not an excuse. I know it's not, she said, not cruelly. But it's an explanation. They're different. A long pause. Is that why you stood up in that diner? Because of Danny? He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said. I think I would have stood up regardless. I'd like to believe that. He paused. But knowing that he asked me to look out for you, knowing that and still sitting there and watching those two men, that wasn't something I was going to do. She was quiet. I'm not asking you to feel any particular way about this, he said. I just thought you deserved to know. I do, she said. Deserve to know. Another pause, shorter. Thank you for telling me. They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people sitting with something that was too large for immediate words, and both of them being okay with that. Get some sleep, she said, eventually. Working on it, he said. Whitfield took the stand on the third day of trial. The trial itself had opened with 2 days of jury selection that Ethan had found more draining than he'd anticipated, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the sustained attention required of watching strangers be questioned about their assumptions and trying to read which ones would be fair and which ones had already made up their minds before they walked in. Sandra was good at jury selection. She asked questions that seemed casual and were not casual at all, and she dismissed 3 potential jurors whose reasons for hesitation she'd identified before they'd articulated them. The jury that was seated was 7 women and 5 men, ranging from mid-20s to mid-60s. Ethan sat beside Sandra and looked at them when it was appropriate to look at them, which Sandra had coached him on. Not staring, not avoiding, just a normal human quality of presence. You want them to see a person, she'd said, not a defendant, not an ex-soldier, a person who sat down for eggs and made a choice. Reedy's opening statement was measured and strategic. He described Ethan as a trained combatant who had inserted himself into a private situation, escalated a social tension into a confrontation, and used his physical presence and implied threat of violence to menace 2 men who had no means to defend themselves against someone with his level of training. He was careful to say alleged at the appropriate junctures. He was careful not to raise his voice. He said my clients with a neutral warmth that invited the jury to imagine Marcus and Paul as people rather than as whatever they actually were. Sandra's opening was shorter. She said, "What you're going to see in this courtroom is exactly what happened in that diner. Not a version of it. Not an interpretation. The footage exists, the witnesses exist, and the timeline is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what story you're asked to build around those facts. The defense is going to show you the facts, and then we're going to ask you to trust what you see." Reed had witnesses on day 1. Marcus, whose testimony was polished in a way that spoke to preparation rather than truth, and Paul, who was slightly less polished in a way that paradoxically made him seem more credible, which Ethan suspected was also by design. They described him as aggressive, as having appeared suddenly and without provocation, as having physically menaced them by blocking the exit. Marcus used the word terrified, which caused Sandra to write something briefly on her notepad. On cross-examination, Sandra asked Marcus a single sequence of questions. When did Paul begin recording? What was already on the screen when you approached Miss Whitmore's table? Had you discussed in advance what you planned to do when you saw her? Reed objected to the third question. Judge Dole sustained it, but the jury had heard it. The second camera footage went in on day 2, after a procedural argument about authentication that lasted 40 minutes, and that Ethan followed more fully now than he would have 6 weeks ago. When the footage played, both angles, the main camera and the narrow service counter angle, the courtroom was quiet in the specific way of people watching something they can't look away from. You could see Paul's phone on the service counter angle, could see the screen already illuminated and aimed before Marcus even pulled out the chair. You could see the timeline. You could see what came before. Reed's cross-examination of the footage expert was thorough and produced nothing useful for his case, which he'd probably known before he started, but had attempted anyway on the chance that the expert might say something he could use. Then Sandra called Whitfield. Colonel Raymond Whitfield, retired, walked to the stand with the unhurried quality of someone who had spent decades entering rooms and deciding immediately how much authority he was willing to extend to them. He was in civilian clothes, a dark blazer and open collar, and he had the kind of bearing that made the clothes irrelevant. Sandra took him through his credentials systematically and without fanfare. 24 years of service, 2 commands, extensive work with Special Operations Forces, direct supervisory experience with Ethan Walker across multiple deployments. She kept it factual and moved through it quickly. Then she asked, Colonel Whitfield, can you describe the training that Navy SEAL medics receive regarding use of force? Yes, Whitfield said. The training is extensive, and it is specifically oriented toward restraint. That sounds counterintuitive to some people who think the training is about developing aggression. It isn't. The combat training is about developing precision, the ability to apply exactly the level of force a situation requires, and not a degree more. The medical training reinforces this in a different domain, the instinct to stabilize, to assess harm, to intervene in a way that doesn't make the situation worse. He paused. A SEAL medic's default is always de-escalation, where de-escalation is possible. Force is the last tool, not the first. In your assessment of Ethan Walker, does this characterization apply? Not only does it apply, Walker was among the most disciplined operators I served with in terms of calibrated response. I never once saw him use force that exceeded what a situation required, and I saw him in situations where excess would have been easy and understandable. Sandra then asked about the sealed records motion. Reed had ultimately prevailed in getting the redacted record admitted, but Sandra had prepared for this by addressing it first rather than letting Reed introduce it on his terms. There are classified portions of Ethan Walker's service record, Sandra said. The jury will see those redactions. What can you tell us about what redaction typically indicates in a record of this type? Redaction indicates that the operations involve national security equities that cannot be discussed in a public forum, Whitfield said. It does not indicate wrongdoing. It does not indicate disciplinary action. The vast majority of special operations records are partially or substantially redacted because the missions are classified, not because anything improper occurred. He looked at the jury directly, not aggressively, just with the calm of someone telling you something true. Ethan Walker's record contains no disciplinary actions, no use of force violations, and no complaints from commanding officers. The redactions are there because the operations he participated in are still classified. That's the whole story. Reed's cross was the most aggressive of the trial. He asked about the nature of SEAL training in terms designed to evoke danger, trained to kill, lethal force, weapons, and combat. And Whitfield answered each one without flinching and without taking the bait, which Ethan suspected was not entirely natural for the man, but which he executed with the same precision he'd brought to more difficult situations. At one point, Reed said, Colonel, wouldn't you agree that someone with Mr. Walker's level of training presents a physical threat to ordinary civilians that goes beyond what most people are capable of? Whitfield said, "I'd agree that training creates capability. I'd also point out that a trained surgeon is capable of doing significant physical damage with a scalpel, and we don't assume bad intent from capability. What matters is what a person does with what they know. What Mr. Walker did in that diner was stand up, speak calmly, and wait for two men to choose to leave. By any measure, that is restraint." Claire took the stand on day 3, and the room shifted when she walked in. Not because she performed, she didn't. She sat down and folded her hands and looked at Sandra and answered questions with the same directness she'd brought to everything else. But there was something in her presence that made the room attend more carefully, the way you attended to someone who had earned the right to take up space by having fought for it repeatedly. She described the diner from the beginning, what she'd been doing there, how Marcus and Paul had arrived, what Marcus had said, and in what tone. She described the 17 minutes before Ethan stood up. What was said, what was implied, what the phone being aimed at her face felt like when she already knew what a public video of her looking exhausted and besieged could do to her company's remaining stability. Sandra asked, "At any point during those 17 minutes, did you ask Marcus Hargrove or Paul Denton to leave?" "Twice," Claire said. "The first time Marcus said we were in a public place. The second time he started talking to Paul as if I hadn't spoken. And when Ethan Walker stood up from the counter, what was your reaction?" Claire paused. Not because she was struggling for words, she was deciding which true words to use. "Relief," she said, "and also, I don't know how to say this exactly, a kind of recognition. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like he was looking for a reason to do something. He looked like someone who had decided that what was happening wasn't acceptable and was going to say so." She paused again. "That sounds simple." It wasn't simple. Those two men have resources, and a father who uses those resources in ways most people don't fully understand. Standing up in that situation cost Ethan Walker significantly more than sitting down would have. He knew that, and he did it anyway. Reed's cross-examination of Claire was the most revealing moment of the trial, and not in the way he'd intended. He went after her credibility, her company's financial difficulties, the board restructuring, the suggestion that she had personal and professional motivations to portray the Hargrove family negatively. He was careful about it, stayed within the lines, but the direction was clear. She was not a neutral witness, she was a woman with grievances, and her testimony should be understood in that light. Claire answered each question without raising her voice. She confirmed that yes, Gerald Hargrove had attempted to acquire a stake in her company. She confirmed that she had refused the deal. She confirmed that the acquisition conflict was ongoing. Then Reed asked, "Isn't it possible, Ms. Whitmore, that your characterization of what happened in that diner is colored by your existing animosity toward the Hargrove family?" And Claire said evenly, "The security footage of that diner doesn't have animosity toward the Hargrove family. It just has a timestamp." The jury moved. Not visibly. No one laughed, no one reacted, but Ethan felt it. The subtle collective shift of 12 people recalibrating. Reedy said, "Nothing further," and sat down. The evidence that broke the case open came not from Sandra's preparation, but from something Gerald Hargrove had done 3 weeks before the trial, which was discovered not by Sandra's office, but by a financial journalist named Priya Sunder, who had been investigating Hargrove Capital for an entirely different story, and who, in the course of that investigation, had obtained communications between Gerald Hargrove and the diner's night manager. The communications showed that Gerald Hargrove's team had contacted the diner the day after the incident with an offer to purchase the security system, the whole system, equipment, and all, at a price significantly above market rate, with the transfer to happen within 48 hours. The night manager had declined because the day manager had already been contacted by Sandra's preservation filing and had been told not to destroy or transfer anything. Gerald's team had not known about the filing. If they had, they would have moved faster. As it was, they'd moved 1 day too late. The journalist published the piece 3 days before closing arguments. Sandra moved to admit it as evidence of consciousness of guilt on the part of the complaint-supporting parties. Judge Dole allowed it over Reed's objection, which was the kind of ruling that came with a particular quality of silence from the losing side, not the silence of acceptance but of recalculation. Reed requested a recess. Judge Dole gave him the afternoon. When they resumed the following morning, Reed announced that his clients wished to address a separate matter with the court, which was the language attorneys used when the case had gone in a direction that required a new strategy. The separate matter was an internal communication within Hargrove Capital that the journalist's story had surfaced. An email from Gerald to his personal attorney sent the morning after the diner incident that read, in its most relevant portion, "Marcus says the Walker situation can be useful. Push the Whitmore board. If she's defending a lawsuit, she's not running her company." The email was 11 words of relevance inside a longer administrative message. Those 11 words were the architecture of what had actually been happening. Not a father defending his son from an aggressive stranger. A business strategy using a son's bad behavior as a lever to destabilize an acquisition target. Ethan sat at the defense table and read the email when Sandra slid it across to him and felt something cold and factual settle through him. Not vindication, that came later, and was quieter than he'd expected. What he felt in that moment was the specific clarity of seeing a thing as it actually was, stripped of the narrative that had been built around it. Sandra leaned toward him and said very quietly, "It's over." He looked at her. "Not officially," she said, "but it's over. Bum." The jury deliberated for 6 hours, which Sandra told him afterward was fast. They came back on a Thursday afternoon with a verdict of not guilty on the assault charge, and with a note to the judge, which juries could do but rarely did, expressing concern about the conduct of the complaint's supporting parties, and recommending that the court consider whether the filing had been made in good faith. Judge Dole thanked the jury and dismissed them, and then looked at Reed for a moment with an expression that did not require elaboration. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was cold and bright in the way of early spring that promised more than it delivered. Whitfield shook his hand without saying much, which was the right amount. Sandra went through the immediate next steps in a few sentences. There would be a civil follow-up, a potential sanctions motion, a conversation with the licensing board that she would handle, and then she looked at him and said, "You should go get your daughter." He did. He picked Maya up from Mrs. Peralta's, and she had chocolate on her face again, and launched immediately into a story about something Rosie had done at lunch that was either genuinely funny or only funny because Maya was 6, and her sense of comedy was still calibrating. He listened all the way home and helped her with her coat and made dinner and sat across from her while she ate and talked. And he was there in the specific way he'd been trying to be there for 3 years. Fully, without the static, without one eye on the middle distance. Later, after she was asleep, he stood in the kitchen and called Claire. "It's done," he said when she answered. "I know," she said. "Sandra sent me a message." "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for the testimony, for staying in it when it got difficult." "You would have done the same," she said. "I hope so," he said. And then, because it was true and he'd been not saying it for weeks in the careful way of someone who knew the timing mattered, "Danny would have liked the way you handled all of this." The silence that followed was soft. Not sad. Or not only sad. The kind of silence that had more than one thing in it. "He probably would have made a terrible joke about it," she said. "Definitely," Ethan said. She laughed, brief and real, and it was the first time he'd heard her laugh without anything else underneath it. And he stored the sound of it somewhere without quite deciding to, the way you stored the things that mattered before you understood why they mattered. "Get some sleep," she said. "Actually sleep. The alarm can wait one morning." "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." He stood at the kitchen window for a while after they hung up, looking out at the street below, the ordinary nighttime life of ordinary people moving through their ordinary hours. He had stood at this window many times in the past weeks and looked out at this same view with the low-grade alarm running underneath everything. Tonight it was quiet, not peaceful. He'd learned to be careful about that word, but quiet in a way that didn't feel like a test. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he slept through until the alarm. Spring came the way it always came in that city, reluctantly, in pieces, with cold mornings that lied about what the afternoon would become. Ethan noticed it the way he noticed most things now, present, without commentary, letting the thing be what it was. He was back on full rotation at Riverside General. Dr. Presser had sent him a one-line email when the verdict came in. "Welcome back, the floor missed you," which was Presser's version of considerable warmth, and Ethan had taken it as such. The return had not been seamless. There was a week of sidelong looks from people who'd read the news coverage and hadn't yet recalibrated. A few conversations with HR that were mostly procedural and once or twice vaguely apologetic, in the way that institutions were apologetic when they'd been cautious at someone's expense. He didn't hold it against them. He understood the math they'd been running, and he understood that institutions protected themselves first and people second. And he'd made his peace with that understanding a long time ago. What mattered was the work. It had always been the work. He was good at it in the way he'd always been good at it. Not inspired, not theatrical, just present and precise when it counted. He could still read a room when he walked into a trauma bay, still knew which numbers to watch first and which attending to flag, and which family members in the waiting area were going to need someone to sit with them before the doctor came out. That didn't go away during the trial. It had just been running underneath everything else, waiting. Diane told him on his third day back, "You look better." "I slept," he said. "Revolutionary concept," she said, and handed him a chart. The civil proceedings against Gerald Hargrove moved on a separate track, with Sandra handling most of it. The sanctions motion for the evidence tampering, the attempted purchase of the security system, resulted in a significant financial penalty and a judicial finding of bad faith that Sandra said was rarer than it should be and more meaningful than it looked. Gerald's name appeared in 2 subsequent news stories about Hargrove Capital's federal investigation history, and this time the stories had teeth in a way the previous ones hadn't, because now there was a judicial finding attached rather than just allegation. Marcus did not apologize. Ethan had not expected him to. Paul gave a brief statement through his attorney, acknowledging that the situation had been mischaracterized and expressing regret for the stress caused, which was the language people used when their attorneys had told them to say something and they'd agreed to say the minimum version of it. Ethan read the statement once and put it down and did not read it again. The Nursing Licensing Board closed its inquiry in the 4th week after the verdict, finding no grounds for action. The letter was formal and brief, and contained no acknowledgement that the inquiry had been initiated under circumstances that were themselves questionable, which was also the kind of thing institutions did when they closed files. Ethan filed it with Sandra's documentation and moved on. What he couldn't move on from, or rather what he chose not to move on from because there was a difference, was the question of what came next. Not professionally. Professionally, he knew the answer. He went to work, he came home, he raised Maya. He did it again. That part had always been clear. The question was what to do with the things the trial had surfaced that couldn't be refiled and closed. He and Claire had continued talking after the verdict. Not every day, not with any explicit structure, just the organic continuation of a connection that had started as necessity and had become something else without either of them formalizing the transition. She called sometimes on her commute. He texted sometimes during his lunch break. They had met twice in person, once for coffee near her office, once for a walk through a park that had been her suggestion and had surprised him slightly because she hadn't struck him as someone who walked for the purpose of walking. She'd said she'd started doing it during physical therapy and had kept it because it was the one part of the day when no one expected anything from her. He understood that completely. They talked about Danny sometimes, not often, and not as the main subject, more the way you reference someone who had been important to both of you in the course of talking about other things. She told him a story once about how Danny had shown up at her office unannounced with terrible takeout food from a Thai place he'd been convinced was good and had been wrong about, and had eaten it anyway rather than admit the mistake. Ethan had laughed in a way that was also something else, and she'd watched him do it and not looked away, which he'd appreciated. "Did he tell you much about his life?" she asked once. "Outside of work?" "Some," Ethan said. "He talked about his family, his mother mostly, and he talked about you, in the way that people talk about things they're not quite ready to name yet." He paused. "I think if he'd had more time, he would have named it." She was quiet for a moment. "I think so too," she said. There was grief in that sentence, and also something that wasn't grief, an acceptance maybe of the thing as it had been, rather than as it might have been, which was the hardest kind of reckoning and also eventually the only one that let you keep moving. He asked me to look out for you, Ethan said. I told you that. I didn't tell you that I've been thinking about it since, about what that means now, 3 years later, in a context he couldn't have imagined. What do you think it means? She asked. I think it means I was supposed to show up, he said. I did it wrong the first time. I'm trying to do it right now. He paused. I'm not trying to make this into something it isn't. I think you would have wanted someone in your corner, and I'd like to be in your corner, if you'll have it. She didn't answer immediately. He'd learned that her pauses were not uncertainty. They were how she made sure she said the true thing rather than the easy thing. You're already in my corner, she said. You have been since a Thursday afternoon in a diner. A brief pause. I just needed to know you were staying because you wanted to, not because you owed him. Both things can be true, he said. Yeah, she said. They can. The memorial was in May. It was held at a veterans garden on the east side of the city, a small, underfunded space with stone paths and benches and a wall with names on it that not enough people visited. The event was organized by a veterans support organization that Whitfield had been involved with for years, and it covered multiple fallen service members from multiple branches. But Ethan had come for one name specifically. He stood in front of the wall for a while before the ceremony started. Maya stood beside him, her hand in his, patient in the way children were sometimes patient when they understood that an adult was doing something important without knowing exactly what it was. He told her that morning simply, "We're going to remember someone today. A friend of mine who was very brave and very funny and who I miss." She had asked if they would be sad, and he'd said probably a little, and she'd said okay, and that had been that. Claire was there. She'd asked if it was all right, and he'd said yes without hesitating. She stood a few feet to his left, not crowding, just present. He looked at Danny's name on the wall. The letters were plain and small among the other letters, and there was nothing about them that communicated what the person had actually been. The specific laugh, the terrible taste in takeout, the way he'd had of making hard things feel survivable by finding the absurdity in them. A name on a wall was not a person. Ethan had known that for a long time, but it was a place to stand and mean something, and that was its own kind of worth. He thought about what he wanted to say and then didn't say anything, because he'd learned over the years that the impulse to speak at these moments was usually about the speaker's comfort rather than anyone else's need. He just stood there and let himself remember, cleanly, without the guilt that had been attached to the remembering for 3 years. The guilt had not disappeared. He wasn't going to pretend it had, because that would be a clean ending of the kind that life didn't actually produce. But it had shifted. It had gone from a weight he carried in front of himself, blocking the view, making everything harder, to something he carried differently, behind him, where it added gravity without obstructing. He had survived. He had spent 3 years treating survival as something he owed an explanation for. He understood now, in a way that wasn't epiphany so much as exhausted arrival, that survival wasn't the thing that needed explaining. What you did with it was. He looked at the name on the wall and thought, I stood up. In a diner on a Thursday. I know that's not what you had in mind when you asked me, but I think you'd have appreciated the specific circumstances. He thought, I'm still here. I'm trying to be useful with it. Maya tugged his hand. He looked down. Is that him? She asked, pointing at the name. Yeah, Ethan said. That's him. She looked at the name for a moment with the solemn attention of a 6-year-old being serious. Then she said quietly, He has a nice name. He crouched down to her level. He did, he said. He really did. The foundation was Claire's idea, though it grew out of conversations they'd had over multiple weeks, rather than appearing fully formed. She had resources and organizational capacity. He had a specific and practical understanding of what people needed in the immediate aftermath of crisis. The moments when systems failed and individuals fell through the gaps that no one had designed but everyone had tolerated. They called it the Walker-Chen Foundation, which had been Claire's suggestion and which Ethan had resisted for exactly 4 days before she'd said, Danny's name belongs on something that helps people. Don't let modesty turn into another way of not showing up. And he hadn't had an argument against that. The foundation's initial focus was narrow: emergency financial and logistical support for veterans navigating the gap between discharge and stability, and for workers injured in circumstances where the institutional support was inadequate and the recovery timeline didn't match the reality of what they were actually facing. No broad mission statements, no ambitious language about changing systems. Claire had been specific about that. We're going to help people in the next 30 days of their crisis. Not the next 30 years. The next 30 days when everything is most likely to fall apart. Ethan handled the intake process design. He had spent enough time in emergency medicine to understand triage, to understand that helping people in acute crisis was not about solving everything, but about identifying the thing that, if addressed first, made the other things manageable. The foundation didn't give money and disappear. It gave money and followed up. It assigned a point person who checked in, who could field a phone call at 9 in the evening when the anxiety peaked, who understood that the paperwork was also a person and the person was also terrified. It was small. They were honest about that. They helped 31 people in the first 6 months, which was not a number that impressed anyone at a fundraising dinner, but was 31 people who hadn't had someone in their corner and then did. Ethan thought about that number sometimes. He thought about what a number like that meant when you were the person inside it rather than looking at it from outside. Whitfield joined the board in September. He did it in his characteristic way, called Sandra, who had connected the foundation's legal structure, asked her what they needed, and then appeared at the first board meeting having already read everything and prepared 3 questions. He did not mention that he'd also made 2 introductory calls to people in his network who subsequently made significant contributions to the foundation's operating budget. He mentioned it later, casually, in the way of someone who considered certain things simply done. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan told him. "No," Whitfield agreed. But Danny Chen served 2 tours and never got enough recognition in his lifetime for what he was. Putting his name on something useful is the least available option. He paused. "And you're doing something worth supporting. That matters. It has always mattered." In October, Ethan was assigned a new mentee at the hospital, a young nurse named Torres, who was 24 and talented and anxious in the way of talented people who hadn't yet learned to trust the talent. Ethan remembered being that kind of anxious in a different context, and he worked with Torres the way certain people had worked with him, directly, without false encouragement, with the specific acknowledgement that difficulty was not evidence of failure. Torres asked him once, between patients, "How do you stay calm in a code? Like actually calm, not just performing calm?" Ethan thought about it. "You stop trying to control the outcome and focus on the next right action," he said. "The outcome is downstream. The action is now. You can only manage now." Torres nodded slowly. "Is that a military thing?" "It's a survival thing," Ethan said. "Lots of people arrive at it different ways." He didn't say, "I learned it the hard way, over years, through losses that I'm still carrying." He didn't say, "The calm is real, but it's built on something difficult, and it costs something to build." He didn't say any of that because Torres didn't need the whole backstory, just the usable part. And there was something clarifying about that, about understanding which parts of your experience were yours to carry and which parts were meant to be passed forward in a form someone else could use. Maya turned 7 in November. She wanted a birthday party with a specific theme involving a cartoon he had only partially understood after watching 3 episodes at her insistence, and she wanted a cake shaped like something he had to look up a reference photo for, and she wanted Rosie to sleep over, which meant 2 hours of giggling after lights out that he had pretended not to hear from the hallway. Claire came to the party. She brought a gift that Maya had not asked for but immediately loved, a book about women who had designed important buildings, because she'd asked Maya once what she wanted to be when she grew up, and Maya had said someone who builds things, which was the kind of answer that deserved to be taken seriously. Maya had received Claire with the frank assessment that children reserve for people they were still deciding about, and then, within approximately 40 minutes, had decided and climbed onto the couch beside her to explain the cartoon show in detail that Claire had listened to with more patience than Ethan would have managed. That evening, after Rosie's parents had collected her and Maya was finally asleep, Ethan stood in the kitchen cleaning up the party debris. Deflated balloons, paper plates, a quantity of sprinkles that had migrated to places sprinkles had no business being, and Claire stood at the counter with a dish towel and helped without being asked. They worked in a comfortable silence for a while. The kitchen was warm and slightly chaotic and smelled like cake. "She's remarkable," Claire said. "She's a lot," he said, meaning it as the compliment it was. "Same thing sometimes," Claire said. He handed her a rinsed plate. She dried it. It was a completely ordinary moment, and he was aware of it being ordinary in the way you became aware of certain things after a period of difficulty. How the ordinary was not default, was not guaranteed, was something that had to be maintained and protected and sometimes fought for. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. Not guarded, just present. "I spent a long time thinking the best I could do was hold things together," he said. "Maya, the job, the apartment, the routine. Just keep the walls up and the floor solid and not ask for anything I couldn't manage alone." He paused. "I thought asking for things cost too much." "What changed?" she asked. "Not when... what?" "Someone kept showing up anyway," he said, "and eventually it was harder to stay alone than to let someone be there." She looked at him for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The city outside was doing its ordinary nighttime things. "For what it's worth," she said, "I wasn't planning on going anywhere." He nodded. He believed her, which was its own kind of landmark, the ability to believe someone when they said they were staying. It didn't come automatically. It came from the slow accumulation of evidence that some people did what they said, showed up when they said they'd show up, stayed when the situation argued against it. "I know," he said. There was no single moment when everything became easier. That wasn't how it worked, and he had long since stopped expecting it to. The weight of Danny's absence did not lift. It redistributed. The professional consequences of the trial did not vanish. They faded slowly, replaced over time by the record of what came after. The things Ethan carried were still things he carried. He had just gotten better at understanding which of them belonged to him and which of them had never been his responsibility to begin with. He thought sometimes about what it meant to survive someone, the specific burden of it, the specific obligation. He had spent 3 years treating his own survival as a debt he couldn't repay and had therefore stopped trying to service. What he understood now, not cleanly, not without remainder, was that survival was not a debt. It was a material. You could do things with it, or you could stack it in a corner and watch it accumulate weight. He had tried stacking. It had not worked. The foundation met its first-year goal in December. Whitfield sent a one-line message. Danny would have complained about the name being on the letterhead and then told everyone about it, which was so exactly right that Ethan read it twice and then put his phone down and didn't look at it for a while. He went back to work the next morning, 12-hour shift, short-staffed, 2 traumas before noon. Torres was on the floor and was getting better, noticeably, measurably better, the kind of growth that happened when someone stopped fighting their own instincts and started trusting them. Ethan watched him handle a difficult family in the waiting room and gave him a nod. After, nothing more, and Torres received the nod with the understanding of someone who had learned what his supervisor's nods meant. He picked Maya up from school that afternoon, and she had drawn something in art class she wanted to show him, a building she'd designed with a tower and a garden on the roof, and what she described as a place for people to sit when they needed to. He asked her where she got that idea, and she said, matter-of-factly, "I wanted to make something useful." He held the drawing for a moment. "It's good, Bug," he said. "I know," she said, which was Maya's version of thank you, and he loved her completely for it. He put the drawing on the refrigerator when they got home, using the magnet shaped like a fish that had been there since before he could remember where it came from. He stepped back and looked at it. Her building with its rooftop garden, slightly lopsided in the way of drawings made by small hands still learning their own reach. Outside, the city moved. People went somewhere. Night came in from the edges. He had once believed that the most he could offer was steadiness, a quiet, functional life that didn't ask too much of anyone, including himself. He understood now that steadiness was the floor, not the ceiling, that there was something above it, reachable, that required not more strength, but a different kind of courage. The courage to be present in the full sense of it, to let the things that mattered actually matter, to stand up in whatever diner, in whatever version of that choice, and say, "What's happening here isn't acceptable, and I'm going to say so." He had told Danny he would look out for her. He had failed the first version of that promise. He was keeping the second version, the one that had grown out of circumstances neither of them could have predicted, into something neither of them had mapped. That was the thing about promises. They didn't always look like what you'd agreed to. Sometimes they arrived years late in a diner, in a city, on a Thursday morning when you were tired and just trying to get through the day. Sometimes they became more than what you'd intended, and the becoming was not a betrayal of the original. It was the continuation of it, in the form that life had made available. He made dinner. Maya ate and talked about Rosie. Again, always Rosie. And he listened to all of it. And when she was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table, that same chair, that same window, and did not feel the low-grade alarm. He felt the quiet and let it be quiet, and sat with it until it became something close enough to peace that the distinction didn't seem worth pressing. Some things you didn't fix. You just learned to live in the space they left, and eventually you built something there. And eventually the building was what you remembered when you thought about that space, instead of the emptiness that had come before. He turned off the light and went to bed. The alarm could wait one more morning.